Lady Margaret Ashworth adjusted her elaborate silk gown and surveyed the grand ballroom with calculating eyes. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads wherever she went, and she knew it well. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry caught the candlelight just so, and her dress was the most expensive creation in the room. She had spent months preparing for this royal celebration, determined to outshine every other woman present. The occasion was Prince Edward's engagement announcement, and the palace buzzed with excitement. Noble families from across the kingdom had gathered to witness this historic moment. Margaret's father, Earl Ashworth, was one of the wealthiest landowners in the realm, which secured their family's position among the highest circles of society. But for Margaret, being wealthy wasn't enough. She craved attention, admiration, and most importantly, she wanted to be remembered as the most magnificent woman at every social gathering. As she glided through the crowd, Margaret noticed how conversations paused when she passed. Men bowed deeply, women curtsied with barely concealed envy, and servants stepped quickly out of her path. This was exactly the kind of reverence she expected and demanded. Her reputation for arrogance preceded her wherever she went, but Margaret saw it differently. In her mind, she wasn't arrogant. She was simply better than everyone else, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of royal grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting rainbows across the marble floors. Tapestries depicting great battles and royal triumphs adorned the walls, while musicians played elegant melodies from a raised platform. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from every corner of the kingdom, and wine flowed freely from silver fountains. Margaret positioned herself strategically near the throne, where she knew she would be most visible to the royal family and their important guests. She had practiced her most dazzling smile in the mirror for hours, perfected the graceful way she held her fan, and rehearsed witty conversation topics that would showcase her intelligence and sophistication. Tonight, she was determined to be the center of attention, even at someone else's celebration. As the evening progressed, Margaret noticed that her usual dominance of the social scene wasn't quite working as planned. The focus remained stubbornly on Prince Edward and his bride-to-be, Princess Isabella of Valdoria. Worse still, she overheard several ladies praising Princess Isabella's natural beauty and humble demeanor, qualities that Margaret found both boring and irritating. How could anyone prefer simple elegance over her own spectacular presence? Her frustration grew as she watched the royal couple receive congratulations and well-wishes. Princess Isabella, with her modest smile and genuine warmth, seemed to effortlessly command the kind of respect that Margaret had to fight for. The princess wore a beautiful but understated gown, minimal jewelry, and carried herself with quiet confidence rather than Margaret's bold proclamations of superiority. The royal guard stood at attention throughout the ballroom, their polished armor gleaming, and their ceremonial swords hanging proudly at their sides. These weren't ordinary soldiers, but the elite royal guard, chosen for their exceptional skill, unwavering loyalty, and impeccable discipline. Each guard had undergone years of rigorous training and had sworn sacred oaths to protect the royal family with their lives. Captain James Whitmore was among these elite guards, stationed near the main entrance where he could observe the entire gathering. At 32, he had served the crown for over a decade and had earned his position through merit, courage, and absolute dedication to duty. His sword wasn't merely decorative, it was a symbol of his oath, his honor, and his responsibility to the realm. The blade had been blessed by the kingdom's highest religious authority and bore inscriptions of ancient protective prayers. Margaret's attention eventually turned to the impressive figure of Captain Whitmore. She had always been drawn to powerful men, and there was something undeniably attractive about his stern composure and obvious authority. Unlike the fawning courtiers who usually surrounded her, the captain seemed completely unmoved by her presence. When their eyes met across the room, he acknowledged her with a respectful nod but showed none of the admiration she was accustomed to receiving. This indifference intrigued and challenged Margaret. She was used to men stumbling over themselves to gain her attention, yet here was someone who treated her exactly as he treated everyone else, with professional courtesy and nothing more. His sword caught her attention as she studied him. It was clearly a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with an ornate hilt decorated with the royal coat of arms and precious gems that sparkled in the candlelight. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself growing increasingly restless. Despite her stunning appearance and calculated social maneuvering, she felt invisible among the celebrating crowd. The attention she craved was flowing toward others, and her usual tactics weren't working. She needed something dramatic, something that would make everyone in the room take notice of her immediately. The idea began forming in her mind as she watched Captain Whitmore maintain his vigilant post. His sword represented everything she found fascinating: power, authority, and exclusivity. Only someone truly special would be permitted to handle such a sacred weapon. If she could somehow demonstrate her own importance by interacting with it, surely everyone would recognize her elevated status among the nobility. Margaret had always believed that rules were for lesser people. Her wealth and position had consistently protected her from consequences, and her father's influence had smoothed over any social missteps she had made in the past. She had grown accustomed to taking whatever she wanted and doing whatever pleased her, confident that her family's power would shield her from any unpleasant repercussions. The wine had been flowing freely throughout the evening, and while Margaret prided herself on her tolerance, the alcohol had definitely lowered her already flexible inhibitions. Combined with her growing frustration at being upstaged and her natural inclination toward dramatic gestures, she found herself seriously considering an action that would have seemed unthinkable to anyone else present. She began moving closer to Captain Whitmore, her mind racing with possibilities and her confidence building with each step. Tonight was going to be memorable, she decided. One way or another, she would ensure that everyone in this ballroom would remember Lady Margaret Ashworth. Margaret approached Captain Whitmore with the confidence of someone who had never truly been denied anything she wanted. Her silk gown rustled softly against the marble floor as she moved through the crowd, drawing curious glances from other guests who wondered what the Earl's daughter might be planning. She had perfected the art of making an entrance, and even her simple walk across the ballroom commanded attention. Captain Whitmore noticed her approach but maintained his professional stance. He had observed Lady Margaret throughout the evening, and was well aware of her reputation for self-importance and dramatic behavior. As one of the kingdom's most experienced guards, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Something about her determined stride and the calculating look in her eyes put him on alert, though he couldn't have imagined what she was actually planning. The captain had dealt with difficult nobles before. His position required him to show proper respect to members of the aristocracy, while also maintaining the dignity and authority of his office. It was a delicate balance that he had mastered over years of service, but Lady Margaret presented a unique challenge. Her beauty and charm were undeniable, yet her arrogance and sense of entitlement made her potentially dangerous in ways that most people didn't recognize. When Margaret finally stopped in front of him, she offered her most dazzling smile. The captain bowed respectfully, exactly as protocol demanded when acknowledging a member of the nobility. His greeting was polite but professional, maintaining the appropriate distance between a royal guard and a civilian guest, regardless of their social status. Margaret had expected more than the standard formal acknowledgement. She was accustomed to men being flustered by her presence, stumbling over their words or at least showing some sign of being impressed by her beauty and status. Captain Whitmore's composed professionalism actually irritated her more than outright rudeness would have. At least rudeness would have suggested that she had some effect on him. She began with what she considered light conversation, commenting on the grandeur of the celebration and making observations about the other guests. Her tone carried the assumption that she and the captain were somehow above the common crowd, that they were both special individuals who naturally understood each other's superiority. She spoke as if they were old friends sharing private jokes about their inferiors. Captain Whitmore responded with courteous but brief replies. He answered her questions politely but didn't encourage the conversation to continue. His attention remained focused on his duties, constantly scanning the room for potential threats or disturbances. This wasn't personal rudeness toward Margaret. It was simply how a professional guard should behave during an important royal event. The captain's apparent indifference to her charms only made Margaret more determined. To capture his attention, she moved closer, commenting on his impressive uniform and the obvious quality of his equipment. She praised his dedication to duty and suggested that such important work must require exceptional men. Her compliments were calculated to flatter his ego while simultaneously elevating her own status by association with someone so obviously elite. As Margaret spoke, her gaze kept drifting to the magnificent sword at the captain's side. The weapon truly was a work of art, its hilt adorned with precious stones and intricate metalwork that caught the ballroom's flickering candlelight. Ancient symbols of protection were etched along the blade's fuller, and the royal coat of arms was prominently displayed on the crossguard. This wasn't merely a weapon, it was a symbol of honor, duty, and sacred trust. Margaret began asking questions about the sword, praising its beauty and asking about its history. She had learned over the years that men enjoyed talking about their weapons and their achievements, and she hoped this topic might finally break through the captain's professional reserve. Her questions seemed innocent enough. She was simply an admiring lady showing interest in the tools of his noble profession. Captain Whitmore answered her questions about the sword with the same polite brevity he had shown throughout their conversation. He explained that it was indeed a ceremonial weapon, blessed for the protection of the royal family, and that each member of the royal guard carried similar blades as symbols of their sworn oaths. His pride in the weapon and what it represented was evident, though he expressed it with typical military restraint. What Margaret didn't understand was the true significance of what she was asking about. The sword wasn't just expensive jewelry or a decorative accessory. It represented years of training, countless sacrifices, and solemn vows that bound the captain to serve the crown with his life. The weapon had been earned through demonstrated courage, unwavering loyalty, and proven competence under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. As their conversation continued, Margaret noticed that other guests were beginning to pay attention to their interaction. Some whispered behind fans about the Earl's daughter speaking so familiarly with a royal guard, while others watched with the kind of fascinated anticipation that suggested they expected something dramatic to happen. Margaret loved being the center of attention, even when that attention carried undertones of scandal or disapproval. The wine continued to fuel Margaret's confidence and impair her judgment. What had started as simple flirtation was evolving into something more dangerous as her frustration grew. She wasn't used to men who couldn't be charmed, impressed, or manipulated into giving her what she wanted. Captain Whitmore's professional composure was beginning to feel like a personal insult to her considerable charms and elevated social position. She began making increasingly bold comments about the sword, suggesting that such a beautiful weapon deserved to be admired properly, rather than simply hanging at someone's side. She wondered aloud whether the blade was as perfect as it appeared, whether the balance was as exquisite as the craftsmanship suggested, and whether someone of her refined sensibilities might be permitted to appreciate such artistry more closely. Captain Whitmore's responses became more guarded as Margaret's intentions became clearer. He politely but firmly explained that the weapons of the Royal Guard were not display pieces for casual examination. They were tools of duty and symbols of sacred trust that couldn't be handled by unauthorized individuals under any circumstances. His tone remained respectful, but there was now an unmistakable note of warning in his voice. Margaret's frustration reached a breaking point as she realized that her usual methods of getting what she wanted weren't working. Her beauty hadn't swayed him, her status hadn't impressed him, and her charm hadn't broken down his professional barriers. The captain continued to treat her exactly as he would treat any other guest, with proper courtesy but absolute adherence to his duties and protocols. The combination of wine, wounded pride, and her lifelong habit of taking whatever she pleased finally overwhelmed Margaret's remaining common sense. If Captain Whitmore wouldn't willingly show her the respect and attention she deserved, if he wouldn't acknowledge her obvious superiority over the common crowd, then she would simply take what she wanted and demonstrate her power in a way that no one could ignore or dismiss. Without warning or permission, Margaret reached out and grasped the hilt of Captain Whitmore's sword. Her sudden movement caught everyone nearby completely off guard. The ornate handle felt cold and heavier than she had expected in her gloved hands, but her determination to make a dramatic statement overrode any second thoughts about what she was doing. The moment her fingers closed around the weapon, a deadly silence fell over their immediate area of the ballroom. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as guests turned to stare at the unprecedented sight before them. Even the musicians seemed to sense the tension and let their melodies fade into uncertainty. Margaret had succeeded in capturing everyone's attention, but not in the way she had imagined. Captain Whitmore's reaction was immediate and instinctive. Years of training took over as he grabbed Margaret's wrist firmly, but not harshly, preventing her from actually drawing the blade from its scabbard. His other hand moved to secure the weapon, while his body positioned itself to shield both the sword and the surrounding guests from any potential danger. His face remained composed, but his eyes showed the alert intensity of a professional dealing with a serious security breach. The captain's voice was low, but carried absolute authority when he spoke. He quietly but firmly instructed Margaret to release the weapon immediately. There was no anger in his tone, no personal emotion at all, just the calm command of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. He treated her exactly as he would treat any unauthorized person who had attempted to access a royal guard's weapon, as a potential threat that needed to be neutralized quickly, and professionally, Margaret felt a shock of surprise at the captain's firm grip on her wrist and his complete transformation from polite courtesy to stern authority. She had expected him to be impressed by her boldness, perhaps even flattered that she had chosen his weapon for her dramatic gesture. Instead, she found herself facing the full weight of his professional seriousness and beginning to realize that she might have made a significant miscalculation. The other guests were now openly staring at the confrontation unfolding before them. Word spread quickly through the ballroom as people whispered urgently to their neighbors about what they were witnessing. Some guests moved closer to get a better view, while others backed away nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness a diplomatic incident or something even more serious. Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of Margaret's longtime rivals, watched the scene with barely concealed satisfaction. She had always considered Margaret's arrogance insufferable and had privately hoped to see her taken down a notch or two. This public humiliation was beyond anything she could have wished for, and she made sure to position herself where she could observe every moment of Margaret's discomfort while appearing appropriately shocked by the proceedings. Lord Hamilton, who had been trying unsuccessfully to court Margaret for months, felt a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment as he watched her create such a scene. He had always known about her difficult personality, but he had hoped that her beauty and family connections would make up for her character flaws. Now he was witnessing firsthand just how deep her problems with judgment and propriety actually ran. The royal family's reaction was swift and serious. Prince Edward himself noticed the disturbance and began moving in their direction, his expression showing concern rather than mere curiosity. Princess Isabella followed close behind, her diplomatic training allowing her to maintain composure while clearly preparing to help manage whatever crisis was developing. The heir to the throne approaching made the situation exponentially more serious than Margaret had anticipated. Margaret's initial confidence began to crumble as she realized that her dramatic gesture was spinning out of control. What she had intended as a bold demonstration of her special status was clearly being interpreted as something far more serious by everyone around her. The captain's grip on her wrist was firm and unyielding, and his professional demeanor showed no sign of the admiration or respect she had expected her boldness to inspire. Other members of the royal guard had noticed the situation and were moving discreetly into position around the perimeter. Their movement was subtle and professional, but their intent was clear. They were prepared to support their captain and protect the royal family from any potential threat. Margaret found herself at the center of a security response that she had never intended to trigger. The weight of the sword in her hand suddenly felt much heavier than its actual physical mass. She began to understand that this wasn't simply an expensive piece of jewelry or a decorative accessory that she could examine and admire. The weapon represented something sacred and inviolate that she had violated through her thoughtless actions. The inscriptions on the blade, which had seemed like attractive decoration moments before, now felt like accusations of her unworthiness to touch such a hallowed object. Captain Whitmore continued to maintain his professional composure, but Margaret could see the disappointment and concern in his eyes. She realized that she had managed to transform his polite respect into something much colder and more distant. Whatever small chance she might have had of earning his genuine admiration had been destroyed by her impulsive decision to take what she had no right to touch. The musicians had stopped playing entirely now, and even the servants had paused in their duties to observe the confrontation. The entire celebration had ground to a halt as hundreds of eyes focused on Margaret and the captain. She had achieved her goal of becoming the center of attention, but the quality of that attention was nothing like what she had imagined. Earl Ashworth noticed the disturbance from across the room and began pushing through the crowd toward his daughter. His face showed a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and growing anger as he realized that Margaret had somehow managed to create a major incident at the most important social event of the year. Her reputation for causing scenes was well known to him, but this appeared to be far beyond her usual dramatic outbursts. Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. She had thought she was demonstrating her sophistication and special status, but instead, she had committed what everyone around her clearly considered a serious breach of protocol and security. The captain's continued grip on her wrist was a constant reminder that she was no longer in control of the situation. The whispers and murmurs of the surrounding crowd grew louder as more people became aware of what was happening. Margaret could hear fragments of shocked conversations, expressions of disbelief, and what sounded distinctly like criticism of her behavior. The social triumph she had planned was turning into the kind of public humiliation that could destroy a reputation permanently. As Prince Edward drew closer, Margaret realized that she was about to face consequences far beyond anything her father's influence could easily smooth over. The heir to the throne himself was approaching to deal with her actions personally, which meant that this incident would be remembered and discussed at the highest levels of society for years to come. Prince Edward reached the scene with the measured stride of someone born to command, his presence immediately transforming the nature of the confrontation. The heir to the throne possessed the kind of natural authority that made everyone in his vicinity stand straighter and speak more carefully. His arrival meant that Margaret's impulsive action had escalated from a social breach to a matter requiring royal attention, something that would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The prince's voice carried clearly through the suddenly quiet ballroom as he addressed the situation with calm precision. He asked Captain Whitmore to report on what had occurred, treating the matter with the same serious attention he would give to any security concern involving the royal guard. His tone was neither angry nor dismissive, but there was no mistaking the gravity he assigned to someone unauthorized attempting to handle a guard's weapon. Captain Whitmore released Margaret's wrist and stepped back respectfully as he provided his report to Prince Edward. He explained the situation with military brevity and complete accuracy, describing how Lady Margaret had engaged him in conversation about his sword, and then suddenly attempted to draw the weapon without permission or warning. His account was factual and professional, neither minimizing nor exaggerating what had occurred. Margaret found herself standing alone in the center of a circle of onlookers, still holding the sword's hilt while feeling increasingly exposed and vulnerable. The prince's penetrating gaze made her acutely aware of how foolish her actions must appear to someone with his responsibilities and understanding of royal protocol. She had never been the subject of such serious scrutiny from anyone of such elevated status. The crowd around them continued to grow as word of the incident spread throughout the ballroom. Nobles who had been engaged in their own conversations now pressed closer to witness what promised to be a defining moment in court gossip for months to come. Margaret could feel their judgment pressing down on her from all sides, their whispered comments creating a constant buzz of disapproval and anticipation. Princess Isabella approached with the diplomatic grace that had already made her beloved among the nobility. Unlike the crowd of curious onlookers, she moved with genuine concern rather than voyeuristic interest. Her presence beside Prince Edward demonstrated the unified response of the royal family to what they clearly considered a serious breach of protocol and security. Earl Ashworth finally reached his daughter's side, his face flushed with embarrassment and barely controlled anger. He had spent decades building his family's reputation and political influence, and he could see years of careful relationship building potentially crumbling because of Margaret's thoughtless behavior. His whispered words to her were sharp and urgent, though he maintained enough discretion to avoid adding to the public spectacle. Margaret's father demanded that she immediately release the weapon and apologize profusely for her inexcusable behavior. His tone carried the kind of parental authority that brooked no argument, but it was clear that his anger was driven more by concern for their family's standing than by genuine understanding of the deeper implications of what she had done. The weight of everyone's attention was beginning to crush Margaret's remaining confidence. She had imagined herself as the graceful center of an admiring crowd, but instead she felt like a specimen being examined by a room full of critics. Every face she could see showed some combination of shock, disappointment, disapproval, or barely concealed satisfaction at her downfall. Prince Edward's patient waiting for her response only made the situation more uncomfortable. He wasn't demanding immediate answers or threatening consequences, but his quiet expectation of an explanation somehow felt more intimidating than angry shouting would have been. The heir to the throne was treating her actions as worthy of serious consideration, rather than dismissing them as a silly woman's foolishness. Margaret realized that she had no reasonable explanation for what she had done. She couldn't claim self-defense, couldn't pretend there had been some misunderstanding, and couldn't frame her actions as anything other than an impulsive grab for attention that had gone horribly wrong. The truth was that she had simply wanted to do something dramatic and hadn't considered the consequences beyond her immediate desire to be noticed. Captain Whitmore remained at attention near the prince, his professional composure intact despite having been subjected to such an unprecedented breach of protocol. Margaret could see that his respect for his position and his duty remained unshaken by her actions, which somehow made her behavior seem even more petty and meaningless by comparison. The silence stretching between them was becoming unbearable. Margaret knew that everyone was waiting for her to say something, to provide some explanation or justification for her actions, but she found herself at a complete loss for words. All of her usual social skills and manipulative techniques seemed completely inadequate for the situation she had created. Lord Hamilton watched from the crowd with a mixture of pity and relief. He realized that he was witnessing the complete revelation of Margaret's true character under pressure, and what he saw was far worse than he had feared. Her beauty and family connections suddenly seemed insignificant, compared to the poor judgment and selfishness she was displaying for everyone to see. Other members of the nobility began exchanging meaningful glances and subtle gestures as they realized they were witnessing a defining moment in court society. Margaret's reputation had always been somewhat controversial, but this incident would likely mark the end of her influence and social standing. Future invitations would be reconsidered, marriage prospects would evaporate, and her family would face the difficult task of rebuilding relationships damaged by her behavior. Margaret's hands were now trembling noticeably as she continued to hold the sword. The weapon that had seemed like such an attractive symbol of power and authority now felt like evidence of her crime. She wanted desperately to let go of it and flee from the ballroom, but she knew that any attempt to escape would only make things worse. The royal guards, positioned around the perimeter, maintained their alert readiness while carefully avoiding any action that might escalate the situation further. Their disciplined restraint demonstrated the professionalism and training that Margaret had so thoughtlessly challenged with her impulsive grab for the captain's weapon. Prince Edward finally broke the silence with a question that cut directly to the heart of the matter. He asked Margaret to explain why she had felt entitled to handle a royal guard's weapon without permission, and what she had hoped to accomplish by her actions. His tone was reasonable rather than accusatory, but the question itself highlighted just how inexcusable her behavior had been. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to form coherent words. Every possible explanation that occurred to her sounded even more foolish when she tried to imagine saying it aloud to the heir to the throne. She was beginning to understand that there was no graceful way out of the situation she had created for herself. The realization was dawning on her that she had destroyed her own social standing through a moment of thoughtless selfishness. All of her careful planning for the evening, all of her expensive preparations and calculated social maneuvering had been undone by a single impulsive decision that she was now powerless to undo or explain away satisfactorily. Margaret's voice finally emerged as barely more than a whisper when she attempted to respond to Prince Edward's question. She stammered something about admiring the craftsmanship of the sword and meaning no harm by her actions, but even as the words left her lips, she could hear how inadequate and foolish they sounded. Her usual confidence and eloquence had completely abandoned her when she needed them most. The prince listened to her halting explanation with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing difficult truths from uncomfortable people. His expression remained neutral, but Margaret could sense his disappointment in her response. She realized that he had given her an opportunity to demonstrate character and wisdom, and she had failed completely to rise to the occasion. Princess Isabella stepped forward with the diplomatic grace that had already earned her widespread admiration throughout the kingdom. She addressed Margaret directly, but with the kind of gentle firmness that somehow made the criticism more devastating than angry shouting would have been. The princess explained that the weapons carried by the royal guard were not decorative objects to be admired by curious guests, but sacred symbols of duty and honor that represented the very foundation of royal security. The princess's words carried particular weight because she delivered them without malice or personal animosity. Her explanation was educational rather than accusatory, but it served to highlight just how completely Margaret had misunderstood the significance of what she had attempted to do. The future queen was treating her like a child who needed to learn important lessons about respect and boundaries. Earl Ashworth's embarrassment reached new heights as he listened to Princess Isabella patiently explain concepts that any properly educated noble should have understood instinctively. His daughter's actions were reflecting poorly not just on herself, but on his parenting and his family's understanding of proper courtly behavior. He could see years of careful political relationships crumbling before his eyes. Captain Whitmore was finally given permission to secure his weapon, which he did with obvious relief and professional efficiency. The return of the sword to its proper place seemed to restore some normal order to the immediate situation, but Margaret could see that the damage to her reputation was far from over. The physical crisis had ended, but the social consequences were just beginning. The crowd around them buzzed with renewed whispered conversations as people began to process what they had witnessed and speculate about the long-term implications. Margaret could hear fragments of harsh judgments and expressions of shock at her behavior. Some guests were already beginning to distance themselves physically from her family, as if her poor judgment might somehow be contagious. Prince Edward announced that while no permanent harm had been done, the incident required serious consideration of appropriate consequences. His tone suggested that this wasn't a matter that could be resolved with a simple apology and forgotten. The heir to the throne was treating Margaret's actions as a breach of royal protocol that demanded formal response rather than informal resolution. Margaret felt a cold wave of fear wash over her as she began to understand that her impulsive action might have legal as well as social consequences. She had never considered the possibility that touching a guard's weapon without permission might constitute some form of assault or breach of royal security. Her privileged upbringing had left her completely unprepared for the reality of facing serious accountability for her actions. The prince instructed Captain Whitmore to prepare a formal report of the incident for review by the Royal Security Council. This meant that Margaret's behavior would be officially documented and evaluated by the kingdom's highest authorities responsible for protecting the royal family. What had started as an attention-seeking gesture was now becoming a matter of permanent royal record. Earl Ashworth immediately began attempting damage control, speaking in low, urgent tones to various influential nobles in the crowd. He was calling in decades of political favors and trying to minimize the long-term impact on his family's standing. But Margaret could see from people's expressions that his efforts were meeting with limited success. Lady Catherine Pemberton made no effort to hide her satisfaction at witnessing Margaret's downfall. She had endured years of Margaret's condescending behavior and social manipulation, and this public humiliation felt like long overdue justice. Catherine began subtly encouraging other guests to share their own negative experiences with Margaret's arrogance and entitlement. The musicians gradually resumed playing, but at a much more subdued volume that allowed conversations to continue easily. The celebration was slowly returning to normal, but Margaret remained the primary topic of discussion throughout the ballroom. She had succeeded in making herself unforgettable, but in the worst possible way. Margaret's expensive gown, which had made her feel so magnificent at the beginning of the evening, now seemed to mock her fallen status. The elaborate silk and precious jewelry that had once announced her wealth and importance now felt like costume pieces highlighting the emptiness of her character when tested under pressure. Princess Isabella approached Margaret directly and spoke to her with quiet sincerity about the importance of understanding one's place and responsibilities within the complex social structure of the royal court. Her words were kind but devastating in their implication that Margaret had fundamentally failed to grasp basic concepts that every noble should understand naturally. The princess explained that true nobility came not from wealth or beauty, but from service, humility, and respect for the institutions that protected their civilization. Her gentle lecture highlighted everything that Margaret had gotten wrong about what it meant to be part of the aristocracy. The future queen was offering her a lesson in character that Margaret was finally ready to hear, though it came far too late to undo the damage she had caused. Margaret found herself genuinely listening to Princess Isabella's words and beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time in her life, how badly she had misjudged both the situation and her own importance. The princess's natural grace and genuine concern for others stood in stark contrast to Margaret's selfish, attention-seeking, and artificial social performance. Lord Hamilton watched Margaret's interaction with Princess Isabella and realized that he was seeing his former object of affection finally confronting the reality of her own character flaws. There was something almost tragic about watching someone so beautiful and privileged discover that their advantages meant nothing when they lacked basic decency and wisdom. The formal consequences of Margaret's actions were still being determined, but the social consequences were already becoming clear. She could see in people's faces that her reputation had suffered permanent damage that would affect every aspect of her future life. Marriage prospects, social invitations, and business relationships would all be reconsidered in light of what had happened tonight. As the immediate crisis wound down and normal conversation gradually resumed throughout the ballroom, Margaret found herself isolated in a way she had never experienced before. The attention she had craved was now a burden she desperately wanted to escape, and the social prominence she had taken for granted had evaporated in a single moment of thoughtless selfishness. In the days that followed the royal celebration, Margaret's world crumbled in ways she had never imagined possible. The formal report filed by Captain Whitmore resulted in her being banned from all royal events for a period of 2 years. A devastating social death sentence that effectively removed her from the highest circles of society. Word of her punishment spread quickly through the nobility, ensuring that everyone understood the seriousness with which the crown viewed her actions. Earl Ashworth's political influence, which had seemed so unshakable before the incident, proved insufficient to protect his family from the consequences of Margaret's behavior. Several important business partnerships were quietly terminated, and long-standing social relationships grew noticeably cooler. The Earl found himself having to rebuild relationships that had taken decades to establish, all because of his daughter's moment of thoughtless arrogance. Margaret's marriage prospects, which had once seemed unlimited despite her difficult personality, disappeared almost overnight. Lord Hamilton formally withdrew his courtship, explaining to mutual friends that he could not associate himself with someone who had shown such poor judgment and disrespect for royal authority. Other potential suitors quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by pursuing someone who had become socially toxic. The isolation hit Margaret harder than any punishment the crown could have imposed. She had built her entire identity around being admired, envied, and sought after by others. Without the constant attention and deference she had grown accustomed to, she felt lost and purposeless. The magnificent gowns that had once made her feel powerful now hung unworn in her wardrobe, as there were no longer any important social events for her to attend. Lady Catherine Pemberton and her circle of friends made no effort to hide their satisfaction at Margaret's downfall. They had endured years of her condescending behavior and social manipulation, and her public humiliation felt like long overdue justice. Catherine took particular pleasure in hosting gatherings that Margaret could no longer attend, making pointed comments about the importance of proper behavior and respect for authority. Captain Whitmore, meanwhile, had returned to his duties with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the incident. His professional handling of a difficult situation had impressed both his superiors and his fellow guards. The incident became a training example for other members of the Royal Guard about how to maintain composure and protocol when dealing with difficult civilians, regardless of their social status. Princess Isabella, true to her diplomatic nature, made several discreet inquiries about Margaret's well-being in the weeks following the incident. The future queen understood that harsh lessons, while necessary, should also lead to growth and redemption when possible. Her concern was not based on approval of Margaret's behavior, but on her belief that everyone deserved the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and become better people. The months of social exile forced Margaret to confront truths about herself that she had spent years avoiding. Without the constant validation of admirers and the distraction of social events, She was left alone with her thoughts and the uncomfortable reality of who she had become. The person she saw in the mirror was beautiful but empty, privileged but purposeless, wealthy but worthless in any meaningful sense. Margaret's relationship with her father became strained as the full cost of her actions became clear. Earl Ashworth had spent his life building the family's influence and reputation, and watching it crumble because of his daughter's selfishness filled him with a mixture of anger and disappointment that was difficult to bear. Their conversations became tense affairs focused on damage control, rather than the warm family bond they had once shared. The servants in the Ashworth household noticed the change in their mistress immediately. Margaret, who had once demanded constant attention and service, became withdrawn and quiet. She spent long hours alone in her rooms, reading books she had never bothered with before, and thinking about conversations she had dismissed as boring when she had been the center of attention. As winter turned to spring, Margaret began to understand that her old life was never coming back. The social circles that had once revolved around her had reorganized themselves without her, and she realized that her absence had been barely noticed once the initial gossip died down. The relationships she had thought were based on genuine affection were revealed to have been founded on nothing more than her family's wealth and her own beauty. The revelation was devastating, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret was free from the exhausting work of maintaining her image and manipulating others for attention and advantage. She began to explore interests and activities that she had previously dismissed as beneath her notice, discovering talents and passions she had never known she possessed. Margaret started visiting the local village, not as a grand lady bestowing charity on her inferiors, but as someone genuinely interested in learning about the lives and struggles of ordinary people. She listened to their stories without judgment and began to understand how narrow and shallow her previous worldview had been. The villagers, who had once feared and resented her arrogance, gradually began to accept her tentative efforts at genuine connection. One elderly woman in the village, Sarah, became an unexpected source of wisdom for Margaret. Sarah had lived through wars, famines, and personal tragedies that had taught her the difference between what was truly important and what was merely fashionable. She spoke to Margaret with the kind of honest directness that the young woman had never experienced from the courtiers who had once surrounded her. Through her conversations with Sarah and others, Margaret began to understand that real respect couldn't be demanded or bought, but had to be earned through consistent actions that demonstrated genuine care for others. She realized that Captain Whitmore's professional courtesy had been worth more than all the false flattery she had received from people who were only interested in her wealth and connections. The second anniversary of the incident at the royal celebration approached, marking the end of Margaret's official banishment from court events. But rather than eagerly anticipating her return to society, she found herself questioning whether she wanted to go back to the shallow world she had once dominated. The person she was becoming felt fundamentally different from the conceited woman who had grabbed a royal guard sword in a desperate bid for attention. Margaret wrote a letter to Princess Isabella, not requesting reinstatement or making excuses for her past behavior, but simply expressing gratitude for the lesson she had learned and acknowledging the wisdom of the consequences she had faced. She made no mention of returning to court, focusing instead on the genuine personal growth that had resulted from her period of exile and reflection. The response from Princess Isabella was warm but measured, acknowledging Margaret's apparent growth while making it clear that real change required sustained effort over time, rather than simply eloquent words. The future queen invited Margaret to demonstrate her transformation through continued service to others rather than through grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Margaret accepted this challenge with a humility that would have been impossible for her before the incident. She understood now that true nobility came not from demanding recognition, but from quietly serving others without expectation of reward or praise. The conceited woman who had seized a royal guard sword had died that night, and in her place had emerged someone finally worthy of the respect she had once demanded, but never earned.